Welcome back to our channel, and thank you for joining me today for what might be one of our most comprehensive episodes yet. If you're interested in biblical scholarship, ancient history, or simply curious about the origins of one of the world's most influential books, you're in exactly the right place. Before we dive into this fascinating journey through the authorship of all 66 books of the Bible, please take a moment to hit that like button if you find this content valuable, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history, religion, and ancient texts. Today, we're tackling a question that has captivated scholars, theologians, and curious minds for centuries: who actually wrote the Bible? This isn't just a simple question with simple answers. The Bible, as we know it today, is a collection of texts written over approximately 1,000 years by dozens of different authors, editors, and scribes. Some books have clear authorship, while others remain mysteries that continue to puzzle biblical scholars to this day. We'll be examining each book individually, discussing traditional attributions, modern scholarly consensus, and the fascinating detective work that goes into determining ancient authorship. We'll explore how oral traditions became written texts, how political and social contexts shaped these writings, and how the process of canonization determined which books made it into our modern Bible. Let's begin our journey with the Old Testament, also known as the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh in Jewish tradition. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Genesis. The book of Genesis, literally meaning beginning, is traditionally attributed to Moses, and this attribution held firm for centuries. However, modern biblical scholarship presents a much more complex picture. The documentary hypothesis, first developed in the 19th century and refined over the following decades, suggests that Genesis is actually a compilation of multiple sources. These sources include the Yahwist source, dating to around the 10th century before the Common Era, the Elohist source from the 8th century, the Deuteronomist source from the 7th century, and the priestly source from the 6th century. Each source has distinct characteristics, different names for God, and varying theological emphases. The Yahwist source tends to portray God in anthropomorphic terms, walking in gardens and speaking directly with humans. The Elohist source is more abstract in its portrayal of the divine. The priestly source focuses heavily on ritual, genealogy, and religious law. These sources were likely combined by skilled editors, sometimes called redactors, who wove them together into the coherent narrative we read today. Archaeological evidence and comparative literature from the ancient Near East have revealed that many of Genesis's stories, particularly the flood narrative and creation accounts, have parallels in much older Mesopotamian texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish. This doesn't necessarily mean the biblical authors copied these stories, but rather that they were drawing from a common pool of ancient Near Eastern traditions and adapting them to their own theological purposes. Exodus. Like Genesis, Exodus is traditionally attributed to Moses, but modern scholarship suggests a similar composite authorship. The book contains some of the most dramatic narratives in the Bible: the enslavement in Egypt, the 10 plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, and the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. The core narrative likely preserves authentic historical memories of a group of people escaping from Egypt, though the scale described in the text, with 600,000 men plus women and children, presents historical difficulties. Archaeological evidence for such a massive migration through the Sinai Peninsula is lacking, leading many scholars to suggest that the actual Exodus involved a much smaller group whose story was later amplified and theologized. The legal material in Exodus, particularly the 10 Commandments and the Book of the Covenant, shows clear parallels to other ancient Near Eastern law codes, such as the Code of Hammurabi. However, the biblical laws often show more concern for the poor and marginalized, reflecting the unique ethical vision of ancient Israel. The various sources identified in Genesis continue through Exodus, with the priestly source being particularly prominent in the detailed instructions for the tabernacle and its rituals. These detailed prescriptions likely reflect the practices of the Jerusalem temple during the Persian period, several centuries after the supposed time of Moses. Leviticus. Leviticus is almost entirely attributed to the priestly source, making it one of the most cohesive books in terms of authorship, though still not Mosaic in the traditional sense. The book is essentially a manual for priests, containing detailed instructions for sacrifices, purity laws, and ritual observances. The book's emphasis on holiness and separation reflects the concerns of a community trying to maintain its distinct identity, possibly during the Babylonian exile or the subsequent Persian period. The concept of the Day of Atonement, central to Leviticus, may have developed as a response to the trauma of exile and the destruction of the First Temple. Modern scholars note that many of Leviticus's laws assume a settled agricultural society rather than a nomadic desert community, again pointing to a later date of composition than traditionally assumed. The book's concern with ritual purity and boundaries between clean and unclean likely reflects the social and religious challenges faced by the Jewish community as it struggled to maintain its identity in foreign lands. Numbers. Numbers presents perhaps the most complex authorial situation in the Torah. The book contains narrative material, legal prescriptions, poetry, and census data, suggesting multiple sources and editorial layers. The title, Numbers, comes from the two census accounts that frame the book, though the Hebrew title, Bamidbar, meaning, in the wilderness, better captures its narrative setting. The book includes some of the oldest poetry in the Bible, such as the oracles of Balaam, which may preserve authentic ancient Israelite traditions. However, much of the legal material reflects later concerns about priestly authority and ritual observance. The narrative presents the 40 years of wilderness wandering as a time of testing and rebellion, themes that likely resonated with later communities facing their own challenges of faith and identity. The stories of rebellion and divine punishment may have served as warnings to subsequent generations about the consequences of disobedience. Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy stands apart from the other 4 books of the Torah in both style and theology. The book presents itself as Moses' farewell speech to the Israelites before they enter the Promised Land, but scholarly analysis reveals characteristics that point to a much later composition. The book's emphasis on centralized worship, its particular concern with idolatry, and its distinctive theological vocabulary all suggest composition during the period of the divided monarchy, possibly in connection with King Josiah's religious reforms in the late 7th century. The book discovered in the temple during Josiah's reign, described in 2 Kings, was likely an early version of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy's influence on subsequent biblical literature is enormous. The entire Deuteronomistic history, comprising Joshua through 2 Kings, is written in the same style and reflects the same theological concerns. The book's emphasis on covenant, blessing, and curse would profoundly shape Jewish and Christian theology for millennia to come. The historical books. Joshua. The book of Joshua is traditionally attributed to Joshua himself, though internal evidence makes this unlikely. The book refers to events that occurred after Joshua's death and shows knowledge of later place names and political situations. Joshua is the first book in what scholars call the Deuteronomistic history, a connected narrative running from Joshua through 2 Kings that was likely composed during the Babylonian exile. This work attempts to explain why the kingdoms of Israel and Judah fell by pointing to their failure to obey the covenant established in Deuteronomy. The conquest narratives in Joshua present significant historical challenges. Archaeological evidence does not support the widespread destruction described in the text, and many of the cities said to have been conquered show no signs of violent destruction during the relevant time period. Many scholars now view the conquest accounts as theological rather than historical narratives, designed to emphasize God's faithfulness and the importance of obedience to the covenant. Judges. The book of Judges is anonymous, but like Joshua, it bears the hallmarks of the Deuteronomistic school. The book's cyclical pattern of apostasy, oppression, repentance, and deliverance reflects the theological interpretation of Israel's pre-monarchic history. The individual stories of the judges likely preserve ancient tribal traditions, but they have been shaped and interpreted by later editors to fit the book's overall theological framework. The famous stories of Deborah, Gideon, and Samson may contain historical kernels, but they function primarily as illustrations of the book's central theme, the consequences of abandoning proper worship of Yahweh. The book's portrayal of increasing social and religious chaos, culminating in the horrific story of the Levite's concubine, serves to justify the later establishment of monarchy as a necessary response to anarchy. Ruth. The Book of Ruth is a masterpiece of Hebrew literature, but its authorship remains unknown. The book's setting in the time of the judges places its narrative in the pre-monarchic period, but its composition is likely much later. The book's concern with intermarriage and its positive portrayal of a Moabite woman suggest composition during the post-exilic period, possibly as a response to Ezra and Nehemiah's strict policies regarding foreign wives. The book's genealogy, connecting Ruth to King David, serves to legitimize David's dynasty while celebrating the inclusion of foreigners in Israel's story. The book's literary artistry, with its careful structure and sophisticated character development, suggests a skilled author familiar with both ancient traditions and contemporary concerns. 1st and 2nd Samuel. The books of Samuel, originally a single work, are attributed by tradition to the prophet Samuel, though he dies partway through the first book. The books are part of the Deuteronomistic history and show clear signs of multiple sources and editorial layers. The books contain some of the most psychologically complex narratives in the Bible, particularly the stories of Saul and David. These narratives likely draw on early court records and traditions, but they have been shaped by later editors to support the Davidic dynasty and explain the transfer of power from Saul to David. The account of David's rise to power and his subsequent reign shows remarkable literary sophistication. The so-called court history of David, or succession narrative, in 2 Samuel may represent some of the earliest historical writing in ancient Israel, though even this material has been edited to fit the larger theological framework of the Deuteronomistic history. 1st and 2nd Kings. The books of Kings, like Samuel originally a single work, bring the Deuteronomistic history to its tragic conclusion with the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. The books are clearly the work of exilic or post-exilic editors who had access to various sources, including royal annals and prophetic traditions. The book's theological framework is explicitly stated: the kingdoms fell because their kings and people failed to follow the covenant established at Sinai. This interpretation of history as divine judgment would profoundly influence both Jewish and Christian understanding of God's relationship with human communities. The books preserve valuable historical information about the divided monarchy, but this information is always filtered through the author's theological concerns. The positive evaluation of kings like Hezekiah and Josiah reflects the editor's belief that proper worship and social justice are essential for national survival. 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The books of Chronicles, written much later than the previous historical books, represent a different theological perspective on Israel's history. Traditionally attributed to Ezra, though this is unlikely, the books were probably composed during the Persian or early Hellenistic period. The chronicler, as scholars refer to the anonymous author or editorial school, had access to many of the same sources used by the authors of Samuel and Kings, but presents a markedly different interpretation of events. The focus is much more positive, emphasizing David's role in establishing proper worship and downplaying his moral failures. The chronicler's concern with genealogy, temple ritual, and the Levitical priesthood reflects the interests of the post-exilic Jewish community as it struggled to rebuild its religious and social institutions. The books serve as both historical record and theological manifesto for a community seeking to understand its place in God's ongoing plan. Ezra and Nehemiah. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, originally combined, deal with the return from Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of Jerusalem and its temple. Ezra is traditionally credited with writing both books, and there is some scholarly support for this attribution, at least for portions of the text. The books contain first-person narratives from both Ezra and Nehemiah, which may preserve authentic autobiographical material. However, the books also show clear signs of later editorial work, particularly in their arrangement and their emphasis on particular themes like religious purity and separation from foreign influences. The book's harsh stance toward intermarriage and their emphasis on ethnic and religious boundaries reflect the challenges faced by the small Jewish community as it attempted to rebuild after the trauma of exile. These policies, while controversial today, served the important function of preserving Jewish identity during a crucial period of reconstruction. Esther. The Book of Esther is unique in the Hebrew Bible for never mentioning God directly, though divine providence is clearly implied throughout the narrative. The book's authorship is unknown, and its historical accuracy is debated among scholars. The book functions as a diaspora novella, providing encouragement to Jewish communities living under foreign rule. The story of Esther's courage in saving her people would become central to the celebration of Purim, one of Judaism's most joyous festivals. The book's literary artistry is evident in its careful plotting, ironic reversals, and sophisticated character development. Whether historical or fictional, the book serves important theological and social functions for Jewish communities facing persecution or marginalization. The Wisdom Literature. Job. The Book of Job is one of the most profound explorations of human suffering and divine justice in world literature. The book's authorship is unknown, and its date of composition is debated, with suggestions ranging from the time of Solomon to the post-exilic period. The book's complex structure, combining prose narrative with poetic dialogue, suggests multiple stages of composition. The prose framework, telling the story of Job's initial suffering and ultimate restoration, may be older than the poetic dialogues that make up the book's core. The book challenges traditional wisdom theology, which held that righteousness leads to prosperity and wickedness to suffering. Job's experience demonstrates that innocent suffering is a reality that must be confronted honestly rather than explained away through simplistic theological formulas. The book's sophisticated theology and its engagement with international wisdom traditions suggest an educated author familiar with both Israelite and broader ancient Near Eastern thought. Psalms. The Book of Psalms is attributed in its superscriptions to various authors, most prominently David, but also Asaph, the sons of Korah, Solomon, Moses, and others. Modern scholarship recognizes that these attributions are often later additions and that the Psalms represent centuries of liturgical development. The Psalms served as the hymn book of the Jerusalem temple and later synagogue worship. They represent various types of religious poetry, including hymns of praise, individual and communal laments, royal psalms celebrating the king, and wisdom psalms reflecting on life's meaning. Some psalms may indeed date to David's time or even earlier, preserving authentic ancient Israelite religious poetry. However, many psalms clearly reflect later historical situations, including the Babylonian exile and the Persian period restoration. The Psalms' enduring power lies in their honest expression of the full range of human religious experience, from ecstatic praise to anguished complaint. They have provided language for worship and personal devotion in both Jewish and Christian communities for over 2 millennia. Proverbs. The Book of Proverbs is traditionally attributed to Solomon, who was renowned in ancient times for his wisdom. However, the book itself indicates multiple authors, including the wise, Agag, and King Lemuel, in addition to Solomon. The book represents Israel's participation in the international wisdom tradition that flourished throughout the ancient Near East. Many of the Proverbs have parallels in Egyptian and Mesopotamian wisdom literature, though they have been adapted to reflect Israelite religious and social values. The book's various collections likely developed over several centuries, with the final compilation occurring during the post-exilic period. The personification of wisdom as a female figure who was present at creation represents one of the most sophisticated theological developments in the Hebrew Bible. Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, or Koheleth in Hebrew, presents itself as the work of the son of David, king in Jerusalem, traditionally understood as Solomon. However, the book's language and philosophical outlook clearly indicate a much later date, probably during the Hellenistic period. The book represents a unique voice in biblical literature, expressing skepticism about traditional religious and philosophical certainties. The famous refrain, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity," captures the book's sense that human existence is fundamentally transient and mysterious. The book's philosophical sophistication and its engagement with Hellenistic thought suggest an educated author wrestling with the challenges that Greek philosophy posed to traditional Jewish wisdom. The book's ultimate affirmation of simple pleasures and reverence for God provides a counterbalance to its more skeptical observations. Song of Songs. The Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, is traditionally attributed to Solomon, though modern scholars generally date it much later, possibly to the Persian or Hellenistic period. The book's authorship remains unknown. The book is unique in the Hebrew Bible for its celebration of human sexual love. The absence of any explicit religious language has led to various interpretations, from allegorical readings that see the book as describing God's love for Israel or Christ's love for the Church, to literal readings that celebrate human sexuality as part of God's good creation. The book's sophisticated poetry and its knowledge of plants, animals, and geography suggest an educated author or school of authors with wide cultural knowledge. The book's inclusion in the biblical canon demonstrates ancient communities' recognition that human love and sexuality have legitimate places in religious literature. The major prophets. Isaiah. The book of Isaiah presents one of the most complex authorship situations in the Hebrew Bible. Traditional attribution to the 8th century prophet Isaiah has been challenged by modern scholarship, which identifies at least 2 and possibly 3 distinct authors or schools. First Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39, likely contains authentic material from the historical Isaiah who prophesied during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. This section addresses the political and social crises of the late 8th century, including the Assyrian threat to Judah. Second Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55, addresses a community in Babylonian exile and promises imminent return to the land. The historical situation clearly points to the late exilic period, and the theological development, particularly the emphasis on monotheism and the suffering servant, represents a significant advance beyond First Isaiah. Third Isaiah, chapters 56 through 66, addresses the challenges faced by the restored community in post-exilic Judah. The concerns with temple rebuilding, social justice, and religious observance reflect the historical situation of the Persian period. Despite these different historical contexts, the book of Isaiah maintains remarkable theological coherence, with themes of God's holiness, social justice, and ultimate salvation running throughout all sections. Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah is more clearly tied to a historical individual than Isaiah, though the book as we have it is clearly the product of editorial development. Jeremiah prophesied during the final decades of the kingdom of Judah and witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. The book contains first-person narratives that may preserve authentic autobiographical material from Jeremiah himself. However, the book also contains extensive biographical material about Jeremiah, probably written by his secretary Baruch or other disciples. The book's complex manuscript history is evident in the significant differences between the Hebrew text and the Greek Septuagint translation. These differences suggest a long process of textual development and editorial revision. The book's emphasis on individual responsibility, its critique of false prophecy, and its vision of a new covenant written on the heart would profoundly influence both Jewish and Christian theology. Lamentations. The Book of Lamentations is traditionally attributed to Jeremiah, though the book itself makes no such claim. The poems respond to the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, and their raw emotion and vivid imagery suggest composition soon after the traumatic events they describe. The book's sophisticated poetic structure, including 4 alphabetic acrostic poems, suggests skilled literary artistry. The poems serve both as expressions of grief and as theological reflection on the meaning of national catastrophe. The book's honest expression of anger, despair, and abandonment provides a model for religious communities facing trauma. The slight note of hope at the book's conclusion suggests that even in the darkest circumstances, faith can endure. Ezekiel. The book of Ezekiel is more clearly tied to a single prophetic figure than most prophetic books. Ezekiel was a priest who was exiled to Babylon in 597 and prophesied there for at least 22 years. The book's complex visionary material, detailed legal prescriptions, and sophisticated theological reflection suggest a highly educated author with priestly training. The book's concern with God's holiness, ritual purity, and proper worship reflects its priestly perspective. The book's famous vision of the Valley of Dry Bones and its detailed plans for a restored temple demonstrate Ezekiel's role in maintaining hope and identity during the trauma of exile. The book's influence on later apocalyptic literature would be enormous. Daniel. The book of Daniel presents itself as the work of a Jewish exile in the Babylonian court during the 6th century. However, modern scholarship has demonstrated that the book was actually composed during the Maccabean crisis of the 2nd century, making it the latest book in the Hebrew Bible. The book's detailed knowledge of 2nd century events, particularly the persecution under Antiochus Epiphanes, contrasts with its sometimes inaccurate portrayal of 6th century history. The book functions as resistance literature, encouraging faithfulness under persecution through stories of past heroes and visions of ultimate divine victory. The book's apocalyptic visions, particularly the vision of the 4 kingdoms and the Son of Man, would profoundly influence both Jewish and Christian eschatology. The book's emphasis on resurrection and final judgment represents important theological developments in late biblical literature. The Minor Prophets. Hosea. Hosea prophesied in the northern kingdom of Israel during the 8th century, shortly before its fall to Assyria. The book likely contains authentic material from the historical prophet, though it has been edited and supplemented by later hands. The book's central metaphor of Israel as God's unfaithful wife reflects both the prophet's personal experience of marriage to an unfaithful woman and his theological interpretation of Israel's religious infidelity. This powerful metaphor would influence subsequent biblical and theological thought about the relationship between God and his people. The book's mixture of judgment and salvation, its emotional intensity, and its sophisticated use of metaphor demonstrate the literary and theological skill of its author or editors. Joel. The Book of Joel is difficult to date precisely, with scholarly suggestions ranging from the 9th to the 4th centuries. The book's author is unknown beyond the identification as Joel son of Pethuel. The book uses the crisis of a locust plague to call for repentance and to promise ultimate restoration. The famous passage about God pouring out his Spirit on all flesh would become central to Christian understanding of Pentecost. The book's sophisticated use of traditional prophetic themes and its knowledge of temple rituals suggest an educated author familiar with priestly and prophetic traditions. Amos. Amos was a shepherd and dresser of sycamore trees from the southern kingdom of Judah who prophesied against the northern kingdom of Israel during the 8th century. The book likely preserves substantial authentic material from the historical prophet. Amos's powerful indictments of social injustice and religious hypocrisy established themes that would become central to prophetic literature. His famous declaration that God desires justice rather than sacrifice would resonate throughout subsequent Jewish and Christian tradition. The book's vivid imagery, drawn from the prophet's rural background, and its passionate concern for the poor and marginalized demonstrate the moral clarity that made Amos's message so compelling and challenging. Obadiah. Obadiah is the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible, consisting of only 21 verses. The book focuses on God's judgment against Edom for its treatment of Judah, probably during the Babylonian crisis of the early 6th century. The book's author is unknown beyond the name Obadiah, which means, servant of Yahweh. The book's brevity and focus on a single theme suggest either a brief prophetic oracle or an excerpt from a larger collection. Despite its brevity, the book addresses important theological themes including divine justice, the consequences of pride, and God's ultimate sovereignty over all nations. Jonah. The Book of Jonah is unique among the prophetic books for being primarily narrative rather than oracular. The book tells the story of a reluctant prophet who tries to flee from God's call to preach to Nineveh. The book's satirical tone, its critique of narrow nationalism, and its emphasis on God's universal compassion suggest composition during the post-exilic period, possibly as a response to the exclusivist policies of Ezra and Nehemiah. The book's literary artistry is evident in its careful structure, its use of irony, and its sophisticated character development. Whether historical or parabolic, the book serves important theological functions in challenging religious prejudice and proclaiming God's concern for all peoples. Micah. Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah who prophesied during the late 8th century. The book likely contains authentic material from the historical prophet, particularly in chapters 1 through 3, though later chapters show signs of editorial expansion. Micah's famous summary of true religion, requiring justice, kindness, and humble walking with God, represents one of the high points of prophetic theology. His prediction of Jerusalem's destruction was remembered and quoted by later generations. The book's concern with social justice, its critique of corrupt leadership, and its vision of ultimate peace demonstrate the moral passion that characterized 8th century prophecy. Nahum. Nahum prophesied the fall of Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire, which occurred in 612. The book's vivid descriptions of warfare and its celebration of Assyria's downfall reflect the relief felt by those who had suffered under Assyrian oppression. The book's literary power is evident in its dramatic imagery and its sophisticated poetic techniques. The opening theophany, describing God's power over nature, provides theological context for the political events that follow. While the book's nationalism and apparent bloodthirstiness can be troubling to modern readers, it must be understood in the context of ancient Near Eastern politics and the brutal nature of Assyrian imperialism. Habakkuk. Habakkuk wrestles with the problem of divine justice in a world where the wicked seem to prosper. The prophet's dialogue with God and God's responses form the core of the first 2 chapters, while the 3rd chapter contains a magnificent psalm celebrating God's power. The book's sophisticated theological reflection and its honest wrestling with doubt and faith have made it particularly relevant to later generations facing their own crises of faith. The famous declaration that the righteous shall live by faith would become central to Christian theology. The book's date is uncertain, but its references to the Chaldeans suggest composition during the late 7th or early 6th century, as Babylon was rising to power. Zephaniah. Zephaniah prophesied during the reign of King Josiah in the late 7th century. The book contains material that likely dates to the historical prophet, though some sections may represent later editorial additions. The book's emphasis on the day of the Lord as a time of judgment would influence later apocalyptic literature. Its call for humble seeking of God and its promise of restoration for the remnant reflect typical prophetic themes. The book's concern with religious syncretism and its support for cultic reform align with what we know about Josiah's religious policies, supporting the book's traditional dating. Haggai. Haggai prophesied during the early Persian period, specifically in 520, encouraging the returned exiles to rebuild the Jerusalem temple. The book's precise dating and its focus on specific historical circumstances make it one of the most clearly datable prophetic books. The book addresses the discouragement and economic difficulties faced by the restored community. Haggai's message that proper worship is essential for community prosperity would resonate with later generations facing their own challenges. The book's emphasis on future glory and its messianic hopes for Zerubbabel reflect the political and religious aspirations of the early post-exilic community. Zechariah. The book of Zechariah divides into 2 distinct sections. Chapters 1 through 8 date to the same period as Haggai and focus on temple rebuilding and community restoration. Chapters 9 through 14 are much later, probably from the Hellenistic period. First, Zechariah's complex visions and their angelic interpretations represent important developments in apocalyptic literature. The prophet's encouragement of Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor reflects the dual leadership structure of the early post-exilic community. Second, Zechariah's oracles against various nations and its vision of Jerusalem's future glory reflect later historical circumstances and theological developments. The section's messianic passages would become important in Christian interpretation. Malachi. Malachi, whose name means, "my messenger," prophesied during the Persian period, probably in the 5th century. The book addresses problems in the restored community, including corrupt priesthood, improper worship, and social injustice. The book's format, consisting of 6 disputations between God and the people, demonstrates sophisticated rhetorical technique. The prophet's criticism of religious and social failures shows that the return from exile did not automatically solve the community's problems. The book's promise of Elijah's return and its vision of the day of the Lord provide a fitting conclusion to the Hebrew Bible, looking forward to future divine intervention and judgment. The New Testament. The Gospels. Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew is traditionally attributed to the Apostle Matthew, also known as Levi, who was a tax collector before following Jesus. However, modern scholarship questions this attribution for several reasons. The Gospel shows dependence on Mark's Gospel, which would be unusual if it were written by an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry. The author demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of Jewish law and custom, as well as excellent Greek literary skills, suggesting a highly educated Jewish Christian writing for a primarily Jewish audience. The Gospel was likely composed between 70 and 85 of the Common Era, possibly in Antioch or another center with a large Jewish Christian population. The author skillfully weaves together material from Mark, a collection of Jesus's sayings scholars call Q, and unique traditions to create a portrait of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah who also offers salvation to Gentiles. The Gospel's careful structure, organizing Jesus's teaching into 5 major discourses paralleling the 5 books of Moses, demonstrates theological sophistication and literary skill. The author's emphasis on Jesus as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy reflects ongoing debates between Jewish Christians and other Jewish groups about Jesus' identity. Mark. The Gospel of Mark is traditionally attributed to John Mark, a companion of both Paul and Peter. Early church tradition, preserved by Papias in the 2nd century, describes Mark as Peter's interpreter who wrote down Peter's memories of Jesus. Modern scholarship generally accepts that Mark was the first gospel written, probably around 70 of the Common Era, possibly in Rome during or shortly after the persecution under Nero. The Gospel's emphasis on suffering and persecution, as well as its explanation of Jewish customs for Gentile readers, supports this context. The Gospel's fast-paced narrative style, its use of the present tense, and its vivid details suggest either eyewitness testimony or access to eyewitness traditions. The Gospel's abrupt ending, with the women fleeing from the empty tomb in fear, has puzzled readers and spawned various theories about the original conclusion. Mark's theological emphasis on the suffering Son of Man and the cost of discipleship reflects the challenges faced by early Christian communities under persecution. The Gospel's messianic secret, with Jesus repeatedly telling people not to reveal his identity, may reflect theological concerns about how to understand Jesus' mission. Luke. The Gospel of Luke is traditionally attributed to Luke, a physician and companion of Paul mentioned in several New Testament letters. The Gospel forms the first part of a 2-volume work, with Acts as the second volume, both addressed to Theophilus. The author demonstrates excellent Greek literary skills and shows familiarity with classical historical writing techniques. The Gospel's emphasis on Jesus' concern for the poor, marginalized, and outcasts, as well as its positive portrayal of women, reflects distinctive theological concerns. Luke likely wrote between 80 and 90 of the Common Era, possibly in Greece or Asia Minor. The author had access to Mark's Gospel, the Q source, and substantial unique material, including the distinctive parables and the infancy narratives. The Gospel's sophisticated theology presents Jesus as the universal Savior whose mission extends to all peoples. The author's careful attention to historical context and his concern to show Christianity's compatibility with the Roman Empire reflect the challenges faced by second-generation Christians seeking to establish their movement's legitimacy. John. The Gospel of John is traditionally attributed to John the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 apostles. However, the Gospel itself identifies its author only as the disciple whom Jesus loved, and modern scholarship has raised questions about apostolic authorship. The Gospel differs dramatically from the Synoptic Gospels in style, content, and theological emphasis. Instead of parables and brief sayings, John presents long discourses and symbolic narratives. The Gospel's high Christology, presenting Jesus as the pre-existent Word who became flesh, represents a significant theological development. The Gospel likely went through multiple stages of composition, with an initial core possibly dating to the late 1st century and final editing extending into the early 2nd century. The Gospel may have emerged from a distinctive Christian community, sometimes called the Johannine community, with its own traditions about Jesus. The Gospel's sophisticated theology, its engagement with both Jewish and Hellenistic thought, and its response to various challenges facing late 1st century Christianity demonstrate the theological creativity of early Christian communities as they sought to articulate their faith in new cultural contexts. Acts of the Apostles. Acts is traditionally attributed to Luke, the same author as the third Gospel. The book's preface explicitly connects it to the earlier volume addressed to Theophilus, and stylistic analysis supports common authorship. Acts provides the primary narrative of early Christian expansion from Jerusalem to Rome, focusing particularly on the ministries of Peter and Paul. The author had access to various sources, possibly including travel narratives, church records, and personal observation of some events. The book's theological purpose is to show how the gospel spread from its Jewish origins to encompass the Gentile world, fulfilling Jesus' commission to be witnesses to the ends of the earth. The author carefully demonstrates the legitimacy of Gentile Christianity while showing continuity with Jewish traditions. The book's historical value is debated, with some scholars noting discrepancies between Acts and Paul's letters regarding chronology and details of Paul's ministry. However, the book provides invaluable information about early Christian communities and the challenges they faced in the Roman Empire. The Pauline Letters. Romans. The letter to the Romans is undoubtedly authentic Pauline correspondence, written around 57 of the Common Era while Paul was in Corinth preparing for his final journey to Jerusalem. The letter represents Paul's most systematic theological statement, addressing fundamental questions about salvation, law, and God's relationship with both Jews and Gentiles. Paul wrote to a Christian community he had not yet visited, introducing himself and his theological understanding to prepare for his planned visit to Rome. The letter's careful argumentation and its engagement with both Jewish and Gentile concerns reflect Paul's desire to build bridges within a diverse Christian community. The letter's theological impact has been enormous, influencing figures like Augustine, Luther, and Barth. Paul's discussion of justification by faith, his analysis of the relationship between law and grace, and his vision of God's ultimate plan for both Jews and Gentiles established themes that would dominate Christian theology for centuries. 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is clearly authentic Pauline correspondence, written around 54 of the Common Era while Paul was in Ephesus. The letter responds to various problems reported to Paul about the Corinthian church, including divisions, immorality, and disputes about spiritual gifts. The letter provides invaluable insight into the practical challenges faced by early Christian communities as they sought to live out their faith in complex urban environments. Paul's discussions of marriage, food offered to idols, and proper worship practices reveal the day-to-day concerns of first-century Christians. The letter's famous passages about love and the resurrection demonstrate Paul's ability to address practical problems while articulating profound theological truths. The letter shows Paul as both pastor and theologian, combining pastoral care with sophisticated theological reflection. 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, also clearly authentic, was written slightly later than 1 Corinthians, around 55 to 56. The letter appears to be a composite of several letters or letter fragments, reflecting the complex relationship between Paul and the Corinthian church. The letter reveals significant tensions between Paul and the Corinthians, apparently involving challenges to Paul's authority by other Christian leaders. Paul's vigorous defense of his ministry and his criticism of his opponents provide insight into early Christian leadership disputes. The letter's theological contributions include Paul's profound reflections on suffering, his understanding of apostolic authority, and his vision of Christian ministry as participation in Christ's sufferings. The letter's raw emotion and personal revelations make it one of the most psychologically revealing documents in the New Testament. Galatians. Galatians is universally accepted as authentic Pauline correspondence, though its date and destination are debated. Paul wrote to address a crisis in the Galatian churches, where other Christian teachers were insisting that Gentile converts must be circumcised and follow Jewish law. The letter represents Paul's most passionate defense of his gospel of justification by faith apart from works of law. Paul's argument that requiring circumcision would nullify Christ's work established principles that would shape Christian theology and practice for centuries. The letter's biographical information about Paul's early ministry and his confrontation with Peter in Antioch provides crucial historical data about early Christian development. Paul's insistence on the equality of all believers, regardless of ethnicity, gender, or social status, articulated revolutionary social implications of the Christian gospel. Ephesians. The authorship of Ephesians is disputed among scholars. While traditionally attributed to Paul, the letter's style, vocabulary, and theological emphases differ significantly from the undisputed Pauline letters. Many scholars believe it was written by a disciple of Paul, possibly using an authentic Pauline fragment. The letter's cosmic Christology, its emphasis on the church as Christ's body, and its detailed household code represent theological developments that may reflect a later period. The letter's general tone and lack of specific personal greetings also distinguish it from Paul's typical correspondence. If pseudonymous, the letter represents the work of a thoughtful theologian seeking to apply Pauline theology to new circumstances. The letter's vision of cosmic reconciliation and its practical guidance for Christian living have made it influential throughout Christian history. Philippians. Philippians is clearly authentic Pauline correspondence, written while Paul was imprisoned, probably in Rome around 60 to 62. The letter reflects Paul's deep affection for the Philippian church and his gratitude for their support during his imprisonment. The letter contains some of Paul's most personal and emotional writing, revealing his struggles with imprisonment and his uncertain future. The famous Christ hymn in chapter 2, whether composed by Paul or quoted from early Christian worship, represents one of the highest expressions of early Christian Christology. The letter's emphasis on joy despite suffering, its call for unity within the Christian community, and its practical guidance for Christian living demonstrate Paul's pastoral heart and theological insight. Colossians. The authorship of Colossians is debated, with arguments on both sides. The letter's style and theological emphases differ somewhat from the undisputed Pauline letters, but not as dramatically as Ephesians. The letter may represent Paul's response to a specific heretical threat, explaining its distinctive features. The letter addresses what scholars call the Colossian heresy, apparently involving angel worship, ascetic practices, and philosophical speculation. Paul's response emphasizes the supremacy and sufficiency of Christ, developing themes that would influence later Christian theology. Whether by Paul or a close associate, the letter represents sophisticated theological reflection on Christ's cosmic significance and the practical implications of Christian faith for daily living. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Both Thessalonian letters are generally accepted as authentic Pauline correspondence, with 1 Thessalonians possibly being Paul's earliest surviving letter, written around 50. The letters address concerns about the second coming of Christ and proper Christian behavior while waiting for that event. 1 Thessalonians reveals Paul's pastoral concern for a young Christian community facing persecution. The letter's teachings about the resurrection and the second coming provide crucial insight into early Christian eschatological beliefs. 2 Thessalonians, if authentic, addresses continued concerns about the second coming, particularly problems caused by those who believed it had already occurred or was imminent. Some scholars question its authenticity based on its different tone and theological emphases compared to 1 Thessalonians. The pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy, and Titus. The pastoral epistles are widely questioned by modern scholarship as authentic Pauline correspondence. The letter's style, vocabulary, theological concerns, and church organization all suggest a later period than Paul's lifetime, probably the early 2nd century. The letters present themselves as Paul's final instructions to his trusted associates Timothy and Titus about church leadership and organization. The emphasis on bishops, deacons, and proper qualifications for church offices reflects institutional development beyond Paul's time. If pseudonymous, the letters represent the work of later Christian leaders seeking to address challenges of false teaching, church organization, and leadership succession by appealing to Pauline authority. The letters' practical guidance and their preservation of Pauline traditions made them influential in subsequent Christian development. Philemon. Philemon is universally accepted as authentic Pauline correspondence, written while Paul was imprisoned, probably around the same time as Philippians and Colossians. The brief letter addresses Philemon about his runaway slave Onesimus, who had apparently become a Christian through Paul's ministry. The letter provides fascinating insight into early Christian attitudes toward slavery and social relationships. Paul's tactful approach, neither directly condemning slavery nor explicitly demanding Onesimus's freedom, but appealing for his reception as a beloved brother, demonstrates the complex social negotiations required by early Christian communities. The letter's personal tone and its revelation of Paul's relationships with individual converts make it one of the most intimate documents in the New Testament. Hebrews. The letter to the Hebrews is anonymous, though it was traditionally attributed to Paul in some parts of the early church. Modern scholarship unanimously rejects Pauline authorship based on the letter's distinctive style, theological method, and lack of typical Pauline themes. Various suggestions for authorship have included Apollos, Barnabas, Priscilla, and Luke, but the true author remains unknown. The sophisticated Greek style and extensive use of the Septuagint suggest a highly educated Hellenistic Jewish Christian writing to a community facing persecution and discouragement. The letter's central theme is Christ's superiority to all previous revelation, including angels, Moses, and the Levitical priesthood. The author's use of typological interpretation and his sophisticated theological argumentation demonstrate considerable intellectual ability and theological training. The letter was probably written before 70 of the Common Era, since it discusses temple worship in present-tense terms. The letter's practical sections, encouraging perseverance in faith despite hardship, suggest a community under stress, possibly facing persecution or social ostracism. The general epistles. James. The letter of James is traditionally attributed to James, the brother of Jesus, who led the Jerusalem church until his martyrdom around 62. However, the letter's excellent Greek style and its lack of reference to James's relationship with Jesus raise questions about this attribution. The letter may represent the work of the historical James, possibly edited and refined by later hands, or it may be a pseudonymous work written in James's name to address later concerns. The letter's emphasis on practical Christian living and its critique of wealth and social inequality reflect concerns that would have been important to the Jerusalem church. The letter's apparent tension with Pauline teaching about justification by faith sparked controversy during the Reformation, with Luther famously calling it an epistle of straw. However, the letter's emphasis on the necessity of good works as evidence of faith complements rather than contradicts Paul's teaching when properly understood. 1 Peter. 1 Peter is traditionally attributed to the Apostle Peter, though modern scholarship questions this attribution. The letter's sophisticated Greek style, its use of the Septuagint, and its apparent knowledge of Pauline theology suggest authorship by someone other than the Galilean fisherman. The letter may represent the work of Silvanus, mentioned as Peter's associate, writing under Peter's authority, or it may be a later pseudonymous work seeking to encourage Christians facing persecution by appealing to Peter's authority. The letter addresses Christian communities in Asia Minor facing social ostracism and possibly official persecution. The letter's emphasis on suffering as participation in Christ's sufferings and its practical guidance for Christian living in hostile environments made it particularly relevant for persecuted communities. 2 Peter. 2 Peter is widely regarded by modern scholars as pseudonymous, written considerably later than Peter's lifetime, possibly as late as the early 2nd century. The letter's style differs dramatically from 1 Peter, and its content addresses concerns that arose in later Christian communities. The letter responds to false teachers who denied the second coming of Christ and apparently used this denial to justify immoral behavior. The author's defense of apostolic authority and his emphasis on the certainty of divine judgment reflect concerns about maintaining orthodox Christian teaching in the face of various challenges. The letter's inclusion of references to Paul's letters as scripture suggests a time when Paul's writings had achieved canonical status, supporting a late date of composition. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. The Johannine letters are traditionally attributed to the same author as the Gospel of John, though modern scholarship questions this assumption. The letters may come from the same community as the Gospel but represent later developments in that community's history. 1 John addresses concerns about false teachers who denied either Christ's full humanity or his full divinity. The letter's emphasis on love as the mark of authentic Christianity and its insistence on the reality of the Incarnation reflect theological battles within Johannine Christianity. 2nd and 3rd John are brief personal letters that provide insight into the practical concerns of early Christian communities, including hospitality, authority disputes, and the challenges of maintaining fellowship across distances. Jude. The letter of Jude is traditionally attributed to Jude, the brother of James and Jesus, though this attribution is uncertain. The letter's excellent Greek and its apparent use of non-canonical Jewish literature suggest an educated author familiar with various Jewish traditions. The letter warns against false teachers who have infiltrated the Christian community and are teaching that God's grace permits immoral behavior. The author's vigorous condemnation of these teachers and his call for believers to contend for the faith reflect serious concerns about maintaining Christian orthodoxy and morality. The letter's use of examples from Jewish history and legend, including references to the Archangel Michael's dispute with Satan over Moses's body, demonstrates the author's familiarity with Jewish apocalyptic traditions. Revelation. The Book of Revelation identifies its author as John, traditionally understood as the Apostle John, though this identification is debated. The book's style and theological concerns differ significantly from the Gospel of John, suggesting either different authorship or significant development in the author's thought and circumstances. The book was probably written during the persecution under Emperor Domitian, around 95 of the Common Era, though some scholars argue for an earlier date during Nero's persecution. The book addresses 7 churches in Asia Minor, offering both encouragement and warning about faithfulness under persecution. The book's complex symbolic language, drawn from Old Testament imagery and apocalyptic traditions, creates a powerful vision of cosmic conflict between good and evil, culminating in God's ultimate victory and the establishment of a new heaven and earth. The book's influence on Christian art, literature, and theology has been enormous, though its symbolic language has also led to widely varying interpretations throughout Christian history. Conclusion: the remarkable journey of biblical authorship. As we reach the end of our comprehensive journey through the authorship of all 66 books of the Bible, we can step back and marvel at the incredible complexity and richness of this ancient library. What we've discovered is not a simple collection of books written by the traditional authors often assumed, but rather a sophisticated anthology created by dozens of writers, editors, and communities over more than a millennium. The Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, represents the literary and theological heritage of ancient Israel and early Judaism. From the composite nature of the Torah, woven together from multiple ancient sources, to the prophetic literature that preserved the passionate voices of those who called their communities back to covenant faithfulness, these books reflect the ongoing struggles of a people seeking to understand their relationship with God and their place in the world. The wisdom literature shows us ancient Israel's participation in the broader intellectual culture of the ancient Near East, while adapting international traditions to their own distinctive theological vision. The historical books present not just chronicles of events, but theological interpretations of history that seek to discern God's activity in the rise and fall of kingdoms. The New Testament represents the literary output of the early Christian movement as it sought to preserve the memory of Jesus and articulate the meaning of his life, death, and resurrection for diverse communities throughout the Roman Empire. The Gospels show us four different communities' understanding of who Jesus was and what his ministry meant. The letters reveal the practical and theological challenges faced by early Christian communities as they sought to live out their faith in complex social and cultural environments. What emerges from this detailed examination is not a diminishment of the Bible's significance, but rather a deeper appreciation for the human processes through which divine revelation was preserved and transmitted. The Bible is not a book that fell from heaven fully formed, but rather a collection of texts that emerged from real historical communities grappling with ultimate questions about God, humanity, and the meaning of existence. The anonymous authors, the pseudonymous writers, the editors and redactors who shaped these texts were not engaged in deception, but rather in the ancient practice of preserving and adapting traditional materials for new circumstances. When later writers composed works in the names of Moses, David, or Paul, they were claiming to stand in those traditions and to speak with the authority of those great figures. Modern biblical scholarship, rather than destroying faith, actually enriches our understanding by helping us see how these texts functioned in their original contexts and how they were shaped by the concerns and insights of their authors and communities. Understanding the historical processes behind biblical composition helps us appreciate the remarkable achievement represented by the biblical canon. The Bible's enduring influence on Western civilization and world culture testifies to the profound insights of its various authors. Whether writing in Jerusalem temples, Babylonian exile, or the cosmopolitan cities of the Roman Empire, these writers addressed fundamental human concerns that continue to resonate today: the nature of justice, the meaning of suffering, the possibility of hope, and the ultimate purpose of human existence. The diversity of biblical authorship also reminds us that the Bible speaks with many voices, not just one. The prophetic passion of Amos complements the philosophical reflection of Ecclesiastes. The intimate psalms of individual worshippers balance the cosmic visions of apocalyptic seers. The practical wisdom of Proverbs enriches the theological depth of Romans. This diversity prevents us from reducing the Bible to any single theological system or interpretive framework. For communities of faith, understanding biblical authorship can deepen rather than threaten religious conviction. Recognizing the human processes behind these texts helps us appreciate how God has worked through history, through real people facing real challenges, to communicate truths that transcend their original circumstances. The Bible becomes not less divine, but more remarkably so, as we see how divine revelation has been mediated through thoroughly human processes. For scholars and students, this exploration demonstrates the importance of careful historical and literary analysis in understanding ancient texts. The tools of biblical criticism, archaeological research, and comparative literature continue to yield new insights into these ancient documents and their contexts. For anyone interested in the development of human thought and culture, the Bible represents one of humanity's most significant literary and theological achievements. Its authors grappled with questions that remain central to human existence, and their insights continue to inform contemporary discussions about ethics, meaning, and transcendence. As we conclude, we can appreciate that asking, "Who wrote the Bible?" is really asking about one of the most fascinating chapters in human intellectual and spiritual history. The answer reveals not simple authorship, but a complex process of composition, transmission, and preservation that spans centuries and involves countless individuals whose names we may never know but whose contributions have shaped the course of human civilization. The Bible's authors, whether prophets or priests, apostles or anonymous scribes, were united by their conviction that human existence has ultimate meaning and that this meaning is somehow connected to the divine. Their varied voices, preserved through the accidents of history and the devotion of communities, continue to speak to contemporary readers seeking wisdom, comfort, challenge, and hope. In the end, the question of biblical authorship leads us not to simple answers, but to deeper appreciation for the remarkable human achievement these texts represent and the enduring questions they continue to pose for every generation. Whether approached as sacred scripture, ancient literature, or historical documents, the books of the Bible continue to reward careful study and thoughtful reflection. Thank you for joining me on this extensive journey through biblical authorship. I hope this exploration has enriched your understanding of these ancient texts and the remarkable people who created them. If you found this comprehensive breakdown valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history, religion, and ancient literature. Your engagement helps us continue creating content that explores the fascinating intersection of history, literature, and human thought. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the rich heritage of human wisdom preserved in texts like these. The Bible's story of authorship reminds us that the most important truths often emerge not from individual genius, but from communities of people wrestling together with life's biggest questions across generations. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.